So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world watching this, either live in Australia and New Zealand or anywhere else that you may be watching the recording of this session. Delighted to meet you all. My name is Lorraine Farrer. I am one of the senior consultants here at Walking the Talk, and I will be joined, and predominantly this session will be led by a co-facilitator of mine, Kim Dutton, and she'll do some introductions just in a moment as we get into the session. So, just as a by way of introduction, let me tell you a little bit about Walking the Talk, but more importantly, let me also tell you about ZRG, which is our partner organisation. So, many of you may be aware that that Walking the Talk has been around in Australia for about 30 odd years, working specifically in culture. And as you can see next on the slide that we're showing you, we are now part of a much larger talent solutions organisation called ZRG. So ZRG are specialists in talent solutions. They have been very prominent in the US, and we have joined forces with them as part of their consulting division, specifically focusing on culture and only culture. For ZRG, there are many other avenues there, so you might see and hear them around the Australian and New Zealand market, but they are also specialists in executive search, specialists in interim project solutions, and also support and help on project-based hiring and RPO solutions. And in the consulting areas, you can see not only do we now do culture, which Walking the Talk is a speciality of, and we are now joined forces with them, but we also do a whole range of leadership and talent strategic things as well as we walk through. So if we just look at the history of Walking the Talk, many of you that are here on this call or are watching the recording may actually know of us. We have been around in Australia. We first started off in Australia, and we have worked with many, many organisations over time in the space of culture. So we are deep researchers in culture, but most importantly, what we're really keen on is partnering and working with organisations to really help you and your leaders walk your talk. In other words, our mission in the world is to make culture doable, and to make culture doable by you within your organisation is really key. One of the areas that we have spent a lot of time in and continue to is really focus in on our speciality of how we assess for culture. Now, whilst we work in lots of other areas, the way and how we assess for culture has been really a foundational base for us as we worked with our clients. And some of you that are here may already know that we may have already worked with you. And for those of you that are new, we work both in the space of qualitative assessment and quantitative assessment. And we do that through a range of different mechanisms around the world, both with small companies and large companies. We do it very much within business unit teams, and we can look at cultures within teams, as well as look at cultures systemically across a whole organisation. Our proprietary tools have been available for organisations to really be able to see what culture patterns exist within your organisation, but most importantly, how culture can be quite distinct and different from engagement, which most organisations nowadays are actually also measuring. And so this is what leads us to the evolution of leaders, because leaders shape culture in a very important way. And whilst we've been working with leaders and how leaders create their shadow, we now have a very alternate and novel and new and innovative way to really support leaders in shaping culture in their organisations. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of today's session about, talking about a new way in which you might want to consider and to do this. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to our lead facilitator to take you through the content for today, which is Kim Dutton. And Kim is one of our other senior consultants here in Australia. So let me hand over to you, Kim, for an introduction and hand the reins to yourself.
Terrific, Lorraine. Thanks so much. And it's really lovely to be with everybody today. So thank you for joining. And as Lorraine was just saying, we're going to really walk through a tool that we have called the Taylor Assessment, which looks at culture contribution primarily, but will also give you a sense of culture fit also. And we'll talk about the two of those as we go through. We'll look at first how and what it's based on, and then we'll give you an experience of the tool, and then we'll talk about some of the applications of that. As we go through, the invitation for you is to really begin to think about your organization as well as yourself. So whilst we'll be applying this and we'll be looking at it in sort of a thought experiment way, I do really encourage you and invite you to think about your business, your organization, what the current culture is, what it might need to be moving forward to reach your desired future state, whether that be your strategic objectives or your business imperatives. your goals, and then also we're going to invite you to think about yourself and the contribution that you're making to give you that experience. So moving forward, just to give you a sense of what the tool is based on, and a number of you, if you've been involved with Walking the Talk, will be quite familiar with something that we refer to as the 6 cultural archetypes. So over the 30 years or 30 plus years now of working in industries across different industries and businesses around the globe, we found that there are 6 basically personality types in cultures that we refer to as archetypes. And the Taylor assessment will be based on these. And you can see them here on the screen. And I'll just give a brief rundown. Basically, achievement-oriented cultures are those that are really focused on getting things done, very results-oriented. You'll hear a lot of language in achievement-oriented cultures around things like accountability. And this is holding oneself personally responsible and accountable, but also having the courage to hold others accountable. They'll talk a lot about things like prioritization and simplification, knowing what to say yes to and what to say no to. Risk mastery, being able to take those risks, but also not shy away, but also not just jump into those. And then there's a strong ability and willingness and capability to see opportunities and to take action that have a good commercial success to those. Innovative cultures are those that are focused on both experimentation as well as continuous improvement. And they tend to be cultures that have a lot of flexibility and agility. They're cultures of learning where people are really seeking knowledge and seeking to understand more about themselves as well as different topics. And where there's also the courage, you'll hear this word a bit coming up, to challenge the status quo, where they'll actually hold the mirror up to one another and really ask, why are we doing what we're doing? Is there a way of breaking this? So it's not just about tweaking things, it's about really disrupting and changing what people are doing. What sits at the heart of one team cultures is collaboration. And so in these cultures, you'll find that there's a lot of communication, a real open flow of communication, transparency in what people are doing. So they don't just use the word, but there's actually a real visibility of what people are doing. When we're talking about collaboration, this is very much cross-boundary collaboration. So a lot of times people will say, well, we collaborate a lot within our team or within our sphere. But what we're really talking about in one team cultures are those cultures where people are really reaching out across geography, across functions, and they're actually informing and involving and including other people, sharing a lot of information. There's a deep generosity in one team cultures where people are very much willing to give their time to one another. And there's also the ability and willingness to have tough conversations when needed. So it's not just a big kumbaya moment. People first are very inclusive cultures that are focused on people's growth and development. They're very much fostering ownership, personal ownership, and empowerment. These are cultures that will have both physical as well as psychological safety. Customer-centric cultures, it's pretty self-explanatory, but these are cultures where they're very responsive and attentive to the customer, where there's a real focus on the depth and breadth of the relationship with a customer client, and where there's deep curiosity. So they're asking questions and asking questions of the client and of themselves about what's really driving this person, what's driving their decision making, why are they doing what they're doing. There's also an interesting balance of looking out and having a strong external orientation, knowing what's going on with competitors and outside and what's impacting the customer. And then also really applying their expertise with the customer in terms of products and solutions and services, but never feeling like they have the complete answer. So there's a real degree of selflessness that's involved in customer-centric cultures. And then last but not least of our 6 archetypes is greater good. And so what really characterizes a culture of greater good is they're very purpose-led, values-led. What they're focused on is something more than just profits and achievement. So there's a long-term focus that really comes into play that you'll hear people talking about in greater good cultures. And you'll hear them also talking about things like sustainability and community orientation, etc. So that's a bit about our 6 archetypes. And we share these with you up front because the Taylor assessment is going to go deep into each of these 6. And this is really what we're looking at and measuring. This is our backstop of measuring somebody's culture contribution as well as their culture fit. So where did the Taylor assessment come from? So historically, as we start to move forward, historically, we were great at actually assessing company cultures. we really knew, as Lorraine was just saying, what drives those cultures and looking at what the current culture is and what the future desired state is. But what we didn't really have a sense of is what was the contribution, or what is the contribution that each individual's making. And we thought it would be super interesting, if not super critical, at beginning to identify and look at this and start to measure this as a way of attracting talent, as a way of de-risking hiring decisions, particularly at the senior leadership level, as a way of developing leaders, as a way of teams really understanding the contribution that each individual makes, and overall, as a way of really understanding how each person is beginning to contribute to what's existing currently in the culture, what's propelling people forward and holding them back, but also how they may contribute to where the culture needs to go to achieve the strategic objectives. The thinking here is that the more people you have, or the more people that you bring in that already prioritize or naturally focus on those behaviors that you really want to dial up and drive within your culture, the faster the journey to get there. So this very much was the birth of the Taylor Assessment, which is named after our founder, Carolyn Taylor. And it's our answer to the question, how does one single individual actually impact the company culture? So instead of talking about this, we thought that we'd give you an experience of just following along and beginning to apply it to yourself. So we're going to
Kim,
move
just
forward.
before you do that, if you wouldn't mind, just before we move on into the experience, which I hope you're going to really enjoy, you will notice at the bottom of your screen that there is a Q&A button. Please, as we go through this, please feel free to just post any questions that you have that will come through to us, and we will answer them. We'll answer them at the end, but as it is appropriate, we'll actually answer them as we go through the session, because you might find some of this quite unique and a little bit different to what you've seen before. So please feel free to just pop them in there. We'll be monitoring that and we'll answer them as we go.
Terrific, thanks. All right, so as we move forward, we're going to look at the 6 archetypes again, and we'll invite you, you're going to do some voting right now through Mentimeter. So we're going to invite you to grab your phone or any other sort of mobile device that you can either take a photo of the QR code in just a moment or log into the website to vote. So in just a second, we're going to end up asking 3 different questions. One will be about your current culture. Then we're going to look at your future culture, what you think that might need to be. And then we'll start to look at your contribution. And so we're going to amalgamate all of the results. So no one person's going to stand out here. So it's all going to be compiled together. Okay, so if you'll grab your phones, here's your first question. So which of these 6 cultural archetypes do you think or feel is strongest in your company culture right now? So we invite you to vote on one of those. So choose one of the cultural archetypes that is most valued or best characterizes your company culture right now. We'll give it just a moment. Oh my goodness. There we go. Okay. All right, so what's beginning to come up is a really strong propensity towards achievement. So any others? Okay, so we'll just look at this. It's customer centricity is coming through also. Terrific. Keep it going, and we'll just do a bit of an assessment as we come through here. So we're just going to invite you to imagine, even though you've just voted on your company, just invite you to imagine that we're all one company and we're all employees of the same organization, and this represents our organization. So as we can see here, the current culture is one characterized by a high results orientation, where there's probably a strong drive for accountability and prioritization. I would imagine looking at this would be an organization, or our organization would be one where people would get a real adrenaline hit of achieving things. And there would be a lot of messaging around reaching results, attaining goals, doing what we all need to do, doing things right. And yet, with this customer centricity coming in at 25%, this will be in service of the customer. So we'll be leaning into what's right for our customer to achieve our results. And then there is going to be that communication across the line, not quite as high. What we don't see here is a strong bent towards innovation. So there may not necessarily be a strong drive towards either continuous improvement, but probably more likely not a strong drive towards greater experimentation, kind of breaking the mold. And yet we've got a little bit popping up here that there's going to be an element of probably purpose-led. Either that, or when greater good comes in low, a lot of times what we see is values-led coming through. And we'll look at what actually makes up each of these archetypes. So purpose-led is about being focusing on a greater inspiration, where values-led is about people being very clear on what their personal values are. And ideally, those are in alignment with one another. And in most cases, those would probably be in alignment with things like customer centricity and achievement. So it just gives us a bit of a snapshot as to what's present right now. But the interesting question is if this is where we are, where do you want to move to? So as you begin to think about what your strategic objectives are, what your business imperatives are, what needs to happen for the future, we now ask you to vote on the second question, or answer the second question, which is, which of these 6 cultural archetypes do you think, feel, or believe your company culture needs more of to achieve its objectives? And let's see how similar or different this is. Ah, terrific. All right. So now what we begin to get a sense of is there's probably a lot of strengths in the current culture with that achievement and customer centricity. But what we're saying now, if this was our company, is that we'd like to see a bit more focus on us, on people's growth, development, inclusion, um, coaching probably also. So that supportive element, there's a greater tendency for, or a greater desire for greater one team, and also really drawing in that experimentation. So keep the greater good, keep the focus on purpose-led and values-led, keep the achievement, but maybe dial the other people-oriented archetypes up a little bit more, as well as the innovation. So really thinking about what do we need to do more of, or differently, or better in our culture or in our organization to really begin to move towards our goals. How might we kind of shake things up with the innovation? All right. The last question, this has to do with you. So what we're going to invite you to do now is focus on yourself and start to think about, how do you personally contribute to your company culture? So as you think about yourself, what are you actually doing? And where are you most motivated? Kind of what turns you on? What is the thing that really excites you or motivates you that you have a preference for? Ah, isn't this interesting? So we've got a real cross section. Okay, here we go. We'll give this just a moment as the voting's coming in. All right. So in our group, we see that there's a higher degree of innovation, which is really interesting when you think about the current culture, not necessarily focusing on that, wanting that. You begin to get a sense of why that may be desired in the future culture. And many of you are saying, at least 38% of you are saying, we really have a motivation to be more innovative, to continuously improve, to learn, to be more agile, to experiment and try new things. If we were to imagine that this was one person, so let's kind of combine all of our results into a bit of a thought experiment and just assess this as if we were one person. As we said, this begins to paint a picture and give us a bit of insight as to how this individual is more likely to behave, how they may impact and influence the culture, and then also what they prefer, what they're motivated by. So as I said just a second ago, what becomes quite clear in this particular hierarchy of archetypes in this voting is that this individual probably does seek out problems for creative solutions. They probably have a real motivation to try new things out, to look for the novel, to try and experiment. And yet this is an individual also who is still achievement oriented. They're still driving. They like to collaborate. They probably will give their time to others more willingly, and they want to involve other people. So there's probably an element of really supporting others, communicating well, being focused on results, but the real preference, the real motivator, the thing they're most attracted to and will probably prioritize in their behaviors and activities is things like experimentation, continuous improvement, trying new things. And this may come at the cost a little bit of, they might try things and try the new and novel at the cost sometimes of what the results may be. So sometimes you can get a little bit of jumping in and trying without thinking about the counterbalance with a lower level of achievement here. So Lorraine, I don't know if you want to add anything before we move on.
Where am I? No, I don't think so. But I do have a question here, Kim, that's just come up as people are looking and have been doing the scoring. One question that has come in is, how does a company actually assess what the future culture needs to be, just as we did here individually?
Yeah, we're going to look at, it's a brilliant question. We're going to look at that in just a moment, how we actually get into working with an organization to determine the future culture archetypes. So what is it that you're looking for? You know, what do you have, and then what is it that you're looking for? And we'll get to that in just a moment. So terrific question.
Mhm. Okay.
Are there
And
any
there's
other
one,
questions?
yeah,
Yeah.
there's one more question here, which is, how do you measure, underneath those 6 archetypes, because they're fairly broad descriptions?
Yeah, that's exactly what the Taylor assessment's going to measure. So we're going to look at what actually makes up each of these 6 archetypes, because there's specific sub behaviors. We call them anchor behaviors that start to combine, that sit at the heart underneath each of these 6 archetypes. And we're going to look at how we actually go about measuring that, and then how you actually look at that and start to make considerations and start to look at the combination of preferences and motivators in the Taylor assessment.
Okay. Okay.
Any others?
And there's one third question. And the third question is, how might this be helpful? I think that question we might hold for the moment, because I can see that we will show in a moment how this will be helpful as we go through and show how the results show up. So if
Yeah,
we're okay, whoever asked that question, we'll just hold on to that one, and we will come back to that in a moment, because I think you will explain it, Kim.
yeah, we'll absolutely go into the detail in just a moment about how this might be helpful. Just as a bit of an overview, it really depends on what you're looking at. So it's helpful in hiring. It can be helpful in leadership development. It can be helpful in a team beginning to understand their contribution to culture. It can be very helpful in the recruitment process. And really beginning to think through. We're working with an organization right now that they've started to think through, where are we? Where do we want to be in 10 years' time? And what are the attributes, the behaviors we really need to retain within our organization, and those that we very much need to either attract in or dial up or start to promote from within the organization. And so they're doing an assessment of all of their leaders at the moment to get a sense of their culture fit in the current culture, which we're going to talk about in a moment, as well as their culture contribution, how they might contribute to that future desired state. And we will go into more detail on that. So terrific question. All right. We're going to show you in just a moment how this is visually represented in a spider diagram. So if we take the voting that you just did, excuse me, there's a few things going on here. And this is still just at the archetype level. So I'm just going to start with the stars first. So the yellow star is the current culture. This is what you voted on in question 1 that was very much about the most valued archetype in your current culture right now. The purple star is your future desired state, so your desired culture. So what is it that you're looking for in the future? And then as we can see, the gray is where you actually answered in terms of your motivators and your preferences, how you're contributing to the culture at the moment. Or as we were doing in our thought experiment and combining it all together, how this individual is contributing. So what starts to come through here is we already know that innovation is very strong. It is the predominant motivator, the predominant preferred archetype for this individual. And one team comes in a close second. What we're beginning to get a sense of here, though, is that whilst achievement is in the current culture, there's a moderate drive for achievement. It's not necessarily high. So again, there may be this bent towards more innovation, and there may be a little bit of issues around risk because they may try things and not actually have the counterbalance of how's this going to impact the business and our results. But what's really interesting here is actually looking at the desired culture, people first, which is what you voted on as the archetype that's needed for the future. And that's not necessarily coming through as strongly here either. It's moderate, it's almost 50%, but it's still quite moderate. So this is an individual that's not necessarily really living the full cultural archetype right now in terms of culture fit, and they may not be contributing currently to the future desired state, but there may be things to pull from innovation that could start to balance some of this out. And we'll look at the detail in just a second. So this just gives us a snapshot of how the archetypes begin to show up. and what we're beginning to look at in terms of an overall profile. What we'd love to do now is just take you into the tool a little bit more to show you kind of how it's assessed, what it's built on. This starts to answer some of the questions about what sits underneath each of the archetypes and what's being measured. And then we'll share with you how the voting takes place and then what the actual report looks like that somebody would get. So as you can see here, there are 5 sub-behaviors, or what we call anchor behaviors, that sit under each of the 6 archetypes. There's a lot more behaviors that sit under these, but these are the 5 that really sit at the heart of each of the archetypes and actually very much create the foundational profile. So if we look at something like so 30 in total. If we look at something like customer centricity, as you can see here, there's a very strong focus on the customer. And so on really being in tune with the customer, in asking questions, a deep curiosity, that relational focus that I talked about earlier. There's a strong external orientation, which we call market driven, as well as that selflessness, which is really about being the expert in your product or service, but not necessarily putting that on top of somebody, actually being interested in what they want and marrying that with what they're asking for. You can see an achievement of strong results orientation with that accountability that we talked about, risk mastery, that ability to say no and say yes in prioritization, and also that ability, that natural motivation to spot opportunities and take actions and turn those into commercial success. So as you can see, there's a level of granularity for each one of these. What happens is if we move forward is you can begin to see how we start to rank all of those. So this is just a sample of one of the questions or one of the prompts out of 27. So the survey is set up on 27 questions, and what people are asked to do is rank 8 of the behaviors in each one of these questions or prompts. And so they sort those in a ranking system, which is great because what it starts to do is give us a sense of some of those trade-offs that people will be making when pressure is on. So under pressure, how might people, and resources are tight, how might people make the trade-offs or lean into one behavior over another? I will say some of the feedback is people say it's frustrating having to rank because they want them all, but it's set up very deliberately. So we begin to see how would you actually work when resources are tight, when time is tight, when the pressure's on, what would you actually begin to prioritize? And this is a bit of a differentiator in other tools that are out there in the marketplace that don't necessarily focus on the prioritization and aren't quite as work related. So over on the left-hand side, you can see some of the other differentiators. We've already talked about this idea that it's created, the Taylor assessment is created on the back of 30 plus years of experience in culture expertise. So we do culture, we don't do anything else but culture in terms of diagnostic and assessment and culture leadership and transformation. As I mentioned just a moment ago in point 2, the language that we use is very business and commercially oriented. It's a corporate language. Some of the other assessments out there, whilst they're fantastic assessments, they may bring in more personal dimensions, whereas we're very much focused on how people are going to react and respond at work. As we've already talked about, there's that ranking system that really puts people under pressure. And then the other thing is we actually capture some of those more modern trends or relevant trends today that people are asking about. So things like purpose-led, values-led, customer orientation, customer empathy, inclusion. So that all is included in the Taylor assessment also. So if we start to move forward, we can begin to get a sense now of what a report actually looks like and how the results come up. So for this individual, as you can see, and let me just direct you, there's a lot going on this page. I'll just direct you to the triangles first, and then we'll kind of walk around, and then we'll get to the blue bars in just a moment. So as we look at this, the blue triangles is where somebody scores highest. So these are their preferences and their strongest motivators. So as you can see here, for this individual, it's accountability, holding themselves and others to account, agility, so probably looking out for problems that require some change and some flexibility. This idea of building strong relationships outside of the team with collaboration, and then coaching, which is about the development of others and people first, etc. So the blue are the highest motivators. The purples start to fill out. This is the highest medium high motivators, and it really starts to fill out the picture. So we can start to see here that this person is quite achievement oriented as well as one team oriented, and where that would begin to come in. And then the pinks and the yellows are the lowest scoring areas, yellow being lowest and pink being medium low. So the yellow actually gives us a sense of what they will deprioritize or where a blind spot might be, which is as important as knowing what their strengths are. So for example, this individual, if we look at one team, whilst they're very strong on collaboration, so they really are sharing that communication, they also are very willing to have a tough conversation when necessary, and they're seeking feedback on themselves and openness. They may not, in terms of generosity, they may not necessarily be as willing to stop what they're doing and give their time, especially with that strong accountability and achievement drive that they have that's showing up in the achievement archetype. So is there anything you'd like to add, Lorraine?
Oh, yes. There's one other thing I'd like to add here, and is as a lot of us are often perfectionists and we'd like to score high on absolutely everything. But as Kim went through and shared with you the ranking methodology, which is unique, and you'll see in a moment, unique relative to many other surveys and tools in the market, it is impossible to actually rank high on everything because you're always making choices. And as individuals, we make choices every day. Every decision we make, everything we're doing every day is always about a choice between this or that. So everybody's report will always have a range of low, medium lows through to highs. That would be the only other distinction I'd add, Kim.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's great. All right. So with this, let's now answer the question about how do you actually come up with the future desired state, so the future culture. So we'll just walk you through how we work with an organization. So if we move forward, go back to the 6 archetypes and the 30 sub-behaviors or anchor behaviors, we'll sit down with an organization, so usually with the ELT or one of the stakeholders, a few of the stakeholders, and we'll ask 2 questions. So what we're looking for are 4 to 6 behaviors around what are the behaviors that you actually want to retain within your organization. Those behaviors that sit under the archetypes that are very unique to your organization that you don't want to lose as you move forward. So they'll choose a few of those. And then we ask the question, what are the behaviors that you actually need? Similar to what we did a moment ago, but more at a more granular level. What are the behaviors that you need to get you to your future state? And so in the next slide, you can start to see kind of how that might pan out. So for this organization, they very much want to retain that strong achievement drive where people are focused on results, getting things done, a strong sense of commerciality and accountability in relation to the customer. So they don't want to lose that. Yet what they really want to dial up for the future is building a stronger culture of learning, kind of that growth mindset, and also care, turning in towards one another and really focusing on the inclusion and the care of others. So these are a real mix and match. So we say choose between 4 and 6. Usually it's a combination of both. Having said that, we've got an organization right now that we're working with that is just looking at their desired culture. And so we have to weave into our conversations because sometimes people don't necessarily score as high on the desired culture. And so we weave into our conversations where they're actually contributing to the current culture, knowing what those behaviors are, but we have to do that verbally. Here's just another example of another mix for another organization where they want to retain generosity and purpose-led. So a nonprofit that's very, very purpose-led and very giving of their time, but they really want to become more focused on the customer, not necessarily feeling like they're the experts. They want to have people begin to seek more information about themselves and that openness. And they really want to focus on that support that they're giving others in terms of coaching and inclusion. So really propping people up there. So this just begins to give you a taste of kind of how we start to work with an organization to identify and define that future state, as well as retain what's important. So when we're looking in just a moment at how this starts to combine into a report, when we talk about the retained culture, what we're really looking at is the culture fit. How well does somebody actually fit with the behaviors that you really want to keep? And then when we're talking about the future desired state, this is about culture contribution. So we'll look at how this builds up into the report and what this might look like and how you would view the results that come through. All right, so here we are. Now we've got our 6 archetypes on a page with the 30 behaviors. If we click forward, we'll now see the chosen archetypes. So as we can see, achievement is the current culture archetype that they want to retain. Customer centricity is what they want to dial up more in the future culture. And now we've got our 6 behaviors of commerciality, results orientation, accountability, 2 under customer centricity of curiosity and selflessness, and then they want to bring in fairness. Now, when we overlay an individual, we can see how they score, kind of where they fit and where they're contributing to this. So as we click forward one more time, we'll now begin to see this individual and where their contribution actually is. So again, we go back to those colored triangles. And as you can see here, this individual is very much contributing to both the current culture as well as the future culture that they're looking for in terms of accountability. And then they're lower in some of the other areas, such as curiosity and selflessness and fairness. So here's an individual who will be, again, very achievement oriented, but may not necessarily be contributing in terms of customer centricity as well as people first. And then there's a lot more granularity that we have here also. Yes, Lorraine.
We have a fabulous question that's come through, which links very much to this slide. So just to ask it now, how often might organizations do a culture check with a view to changing their culture focus? So why don't I take that just up front, Kim? It varies from organization to organization, but typically our experience has been that organizations might do a review of their target culture sort of every 3 years, sometimes up to 5 years. So somewhere in that sort of 3-year to 5-year mark is where you'd normally do that. Any shorter than that, you're not really shifting culture, because as most of you here on this call would know, changing culture is a little bit like moving the Titanic. It takes time to shift culture. It's quicker to shift climate with shorter term things, but culture is more aligned to your strategy, and strategies tend to be in that 3 to 4 year mark. So that would be the time frame that we would recommend that this be looked at. And as you can see here on this slide, not only do you get a sense of where people are, it actually helps you de-risk hiring, but it also can really help you in terms of where you might want to do leadership development, where you're looking for those aspirational culture areas that may need some additional development from your existing leaders in the organization to really role model that target culture. Back to you, Kim.
There we go. Sorry about that. So thank you. The last thing that we'd like to show you is just 3 applications of where you might use this. So this really gets back to the question around use. So one we've been talking about, and Lorraine just referred to it, is around recruitment. And so what you can see here is a bit of a heat map. So when you've got a slate of candidates, it allows you to quickly assess in terms of culture fit as well as culture contribution when you know kind of what that cultural profile is. So here we've got 4 candidates. It gives you a really quick sense of where people score high, medium, and low. And then there's 2 other areas down at the bottom. You can see complementary contributions and potential risks. What we also do is we'll give you a sense of some of the areas or the behaviors that are motivating for them that may not necessarily be part of your culture profile, but may still be quite important or useful when you're thinking about the assessment in hiring this individual. So where will they naturally prefer to go or act or behave, and what would they be motivated by? So again, it allows you just to get a very quick sense and comparison of individuals, and it might expand your view of a candidate and really pinpoint how they're going to contribute. The next one, and Lorraine mentioned this earlier, is leadership development. So really beginning to give people a sense of where they fit, as well as what that contribution is, where the strengths are, as well as where the gaps are. And then we work with people to actually build an action plan. So we go quite deep in this and doing one-on-one debriefs. We can run train the trainers to enable your organization to do this also and do the assessments as well as the debriefs. But again, it gives people just this very strong sense of how am I showing up as a culture leader currently, and how might I need to show up as I move to the future. And then the last one is for team building. And this again begins to highlight where each individual on a team is contributing and what their contribution is to both the overarching organizational culture, but also what we begin to get here is a strong sense of what some of those team subcultures are. And again, what it allows people to do is understand themselves better, but also their colleagues and their peers better. And it allows them to really draw on the strengths of one another in their team environment. And also indicates some potential areas of development that may be highlighted. So with that, we thought that we would open up for some more questions. Are there other questions, Lorraine, that you've seen? You're on mute.
Yes, I am on mute. Yes, there is one other question here. Let me just read this out to you. How often is there a contradiction between the desired culture and the strategy? For example, the strategy is very outcomes focused, yet the desired culture lacks the achievement and outcome related elements. What action or advice do you provide?
Yeah,
How about you take that, Kim?
Yeah, no problem. So when we're having initial conversations, one of the things that we talk about when we're defining the future desired culture is what's the culture that's going to get you your results. So it's not what's the culture that you just sort of want, it's where are you headed, what are your business imperatives, what is your strategy, and what are the cultural archetypes and the specific behaviors in this case that are actually going to drive the behaviors to get you to that result. So it's not one or the other, they're absolutely aligned because the belief is that culture is always in service of your strategy. And so we work with an organization to get a very clear alignment on what those specific behaviors are that are needed. Now, they may be different than what you've currently got, but we would never just say, hey, just pick some that you like. It is very much around what's your strategy. And we run a workshop with usually the senior leadership team, the executive leadership team, to get very, very clear on what that is. What are the business imperatives? And then what are the behaviors that are going to really drive the overarching behaviors in the organization to get to where they need to go? Is there anything you'd add?
No, I think you've answered that perfectly. And it's very interesting. I was with a client just this morning talking about exactly that. They've got a whole range of behaviors they think are very aligned. And the question I asked this client is, are you absolutely sure you've considered the most appropriate behaviors for delivering on that strategy, or you've considered great behaviors that look really important for your values? And that client actually sat back and said, I don't know the answer to that question. So it's about alignment between the two, and not that what you've got is wrong. It's a matter of, is there something maybe missing that will be key to unlocking the culture for the future, which is key. Great. But we have no other open questions at this stage, Kim.
No worries. I'll show one more thing. I was just going to say, in most organizations, there will be, as I said before, retained behaviors, and there will also be desired behaviors, new behaviors. In some, though, they say, you know what, we've got the behaviors that we want. We just really need to and want to embed those more strongly and get greater alignment around the behaviors that we have in place right now. So as Lorraine was just saying, it really is dependent upon the organization. Okay, one last thing, and we get asked this question quite a bit, so we thought that we would just share how the Taylor assessment compares to other tools that are out there. So here's some of the common ones that we get asked about, or the most common questions that we have. So, excuse me, some of you will be quite familiar with the Korn Ferry Four Dimensions of Leadership. Again, I'll just do a really brief kind of comparison of those. So the Korn Ferry assessment does a great job at assessing how a leader really leads themselves around things like accountability, around willingness to take action, productivity, etc. The Taylor assessment is a really nice complement to the Korn Ferry KF4D, which I can never say really quickly. But this is specifically looking at how leaders lead others. So it gives people a real sense of their culture leadership and the impact and the influence they'll be having on others. And the idea here is if somebody is really strong and very much motivated by a particular behavior, especially if they're in a leadership position, others will follow their lead because they're kind of following the leader of sorts. So we're looking at how others lead, or how leaders lead others. The Gallup-Clifton Strengths, again, the TA, or our Taylor assessment, and the Clifton Strengths, neither one of these are predictive tools. The Clifton Strengths really looks at how somebody, or what somebody's natural styles and preferences are, what they're good at. It has a very positive spin, which is quite productive, but it's harder in the Cliftons to assess risk and some of those development areas. Whereas in the Taylor assessment, again, it's quite positive. We also kind of talk about strengths as those natural motivators and what sits underneath those. but we also are talking about some of the areas that are watch out or risk areas and areas for greater development in alignment with the culture. PXT is more of a capabilities assessment. So this is the Wiley's PXT. It really is looking at things like cognitive skills, numeracy, verbal reasoning, and this is very much around role fit, or more about role fit, whereas as we've talked about, what we're looking at is culture fit and culture contribution. And then a number of you might be familiar with Hogan, and they've got several tools there. We're probably most closely aligned with the MVPI, so the motivators, preferences, values, and preferences inventory. Again, we're looking at preferences and they're looking at preferences also. Hogan has a few more personal preferences, and they include things like science and hedonism and preferences such as that, whereas we're actually taking a more work-related. So theirs is broader and more personal. It doesn't have as much of a work focus, whereas ours is very, very targeted to the business environment in specific ways that people will show up at work, as we talked about. And then there's a number of 360s and 180s. There's a whole number and range of those out there, all great. The one thing that we have found is that over time, when organizations are using a similar 180 or 360, people become quite familiar with it. And we've had a couple of clients talk about the fact that they feel that people are kind of gaming it. Whereas the Taylor assessment with this ranking, and again, they do measure different things, but with this ranking gives you yet just another data point to assess how somebody will show up at work, what their natural motivators, their natural preferences are, and where they're naturally going to contribute, and where they might not also. So basically, overall, what we're looking at here is something that's quite practical, that's very actionable, and that really starts to focus in on, as we've been talking about, culture, and it's probably one of the only tools out there that's doing that. Yeah, Lorraine.
Great. Got another question as well. I know we're right on time, so we appreciate some of you might need to leave at this time, but Kim and I are very happy to stay on for a little bit longer if anybody else would like to continue to ask questions to the top of the hour. So your call. But we do have a great question here, Kim. Would you ever do an assessment at ELT level and also perhaps at a senior manager level within the same organization to understand if there's a gap between current and future state perceptions between leader levels?
It's a terrific question. I'm actually doing that right now. So yes, I'm working with an organization right now, a devices company, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking all of the leaders through. The ELT have gone through as a cohort. They've been part of the assessment at the same time, but we're debriefing them as a cohort, and then we're looking at the other leaders. Now, they have a very clearly defined current culture and they've done a lot of diagnostic on that, and they have a very clear definition of where they're headed, and they're on that path. But that question that you've just asked, if I've interpreted it correctly, is giving each group a sense of how are we tracking, where are our strengths and our gaps, and where are the strengths and the gaps between the ELT and the senior leadership team. So very much that is what they're looking at. And it's also coming up that the ELT is very strong in some areas, and the leadership team is strong in some of those areas, but also in others. And so there is a gap. And so there's some really interesting conversations that we're going to be having in about 2 weeks' time with all of that as we get the rest of the debriefs done. It's a great question. All right. Anything else?
Fabulous. No other questions at this stage, Kim. So I think we might wrap it to a close. And then if anybody would like to stay on and ask other questions, then feel free. We're very happy to stay here for another 5 or 10 minutes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If you do have any questions or if you're interested, the QR code will give you some more information. It'll take you to our site, or just drop myself. You can see my email address there. You can drop me a message, and we'll happily get back to you. So thank you again. Really appreciate your time and your interest, and we look forward to seeing you on the next Culture Lab.